today's presentation is the second in our series in which we are exploring different fibres and fibres for end uses. It could be fashion, it could be interiors, but we're looking at their material source, production, suitability, and most importantly, their sustainability for the end uses they are put to. So we're extremely grateful to Nicole today, who is going to, who agreed to do this presentation today, who is going to talk about viscose, which is such an important fibre, particularly for fashion. So, but before we go any further, I just want to say, just a bit of housekeeping. If you could remember, please, to keep yourselves muted and put questions in the chat box. And we'll be looking at those later on in the presentation. But first of all, I'm going to hand over to Ian Morris, who's going to give a better introduction to Nicole and explain a little bit about what she's going to do.
Thanks very much indeed, Philippa, and good afternoon, everybody. Good to see you all. So I'd like to again welcome Nicole Morarescu from Primark to present to us this afternoon. Nicole works for Primark and she's one of their global sustainability specialists. She has over 10 years experience in the fashion industry and she leads the circularity agenda for Primark, and she collaborates with colleagues across the business to evaluate sustainable materials innovations. Now, to help deliver that, she travels extensively, and just this year alone, she's travelled to Stockholm to the Ellen MacArthur Summit. She was earlier in the year visiting recyclers in Helsinki. Just in the last day, she's returned from the US, where she was attending the Textile Exchange conference in Colorado Springs. So with such extensive experience and the very latest information, we're really looking forward to hearing from Nicole about man-made cellulosic fibres and how they're becoming the latest sustainable fibres.
Well, yes, thank you again for inviting me to present this talk, and hopefully there's something for everyone and that you'll learn something new. And as Ian said, I've just come back from the Textile Exchange conference. I've tried to reflect some of the learnings from that conference in this presentation as well. So as Ian has already mentioned, I'm part of Primark's environmental sustainability team, and we actually have around, well, including with our ethical trade team, we have around 130 specialists across the globe in about 12 of our key sourcing countries, where we have our sourcing and manufacturing, but also our offices as well. And this is a picture actually taken earlier on this year, which probably shows only about a quarter of us, but we have an amazing team and amazing experts in a lot of different subject matter areas. But my speciality is really materials and circularity. And before we kind of deep dive into the main topic of this presentation, I just wanted to highlight some of the work that we're doing at Primark and our latest sustainability strategy, which we published last year, which you may have seen already on the internet. But essentially, we look at three pillars. So the first one being product, the second one being planet, and a third one being around our people in our supply chain. And within product, we actually look at how clothes can be designed or made from more sustainable materials and also recycled fibres. So really relevant for the discussion that we're going to talk about today. So just a quick brief overview of what we're going to talk about. I'm going to first of all talk to you a little bit about MMCFs. What are they? What does that actually mean? But I'm really going to deep dive then into what viscose is and what the difference is between viscose and the other MMCF fibres. I think most importantly, we're then going to touch on what are the impacts of viscose, and lastly end with how is viscose becoming more sustainable. And there's lots of new great innovations out there which I'll share with you and hopefully inspire you as well. So MMCF, it's a term that we use quite a lot within our organisation, but I'm sure you're probably aware that the fabrics that we wear, the fabrics that we use in our homes are made from a range of fibres and really can be categorised into two different categories. So the first one being natural materials, but also looking at man-made fibres. And there are a number of different categories within these two buckets. I won't go through all of them, but essentially, you can see on the left-hand slide, we're really talking about plant-based or cellulosic fibres, as well as animal-derived materials, whereas man-made, we're looking at more synthetic polymer-based materials. And this includes MMCF, because MMCF is derived from a cellulosic material, but it's actually regenerated and turned in a man-made fibre. And more recently on the market, we've seen a lot of biosynthetics, which I'm not going to talk about in detail today, but that might be another topic that you want to deep dive into in the future, because there's a lot of happening around that space as well. And these slides and the recording will be shared with you, but I won't go through the detail of all of these, but essentially this is what we're going to focus on today. We're going to focus on this bucket called MMCF fibres and the number of different fibres that fall within that. So here we're looking at viscose, which is also known as rayon. We're looking at lyocell, we're looking at modal, acetate and cupro as well. And just to put man-made cellulosic fibres into a bit of perspective around the global fibre market share, this is some data which was pulled from the Textile Exchange website and data from last year, 2021. And they estimated that around 7 million tonnes of MMCFs were produced in the last year. And that's approximately around 6% of the global fibre market share. And of that 6%, we're also seeing an increase in the use of recycled MMCFs, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that means later on. But essentially, these are about 0.5% of the market today, and we see that really growing in the future as well, because there's a lot of innovation happening in that space. And so like all fibres, there are really a number of different manufacturing steps before the fibre reaches a product. And here I've just tried to simplify the MMCF supply chain. So this is very similar for whether we're talking about viscose or we're talking about lyocell, we're talking about modal as well. And it really starts with, first of all, the feedstock. So really making sure that these are cellulosic based for the purpose of MMCF. So traditionally we would have seen these fibres made from wood, but we're also seeing an increase in fibres being made from bamboo cellulosic feedstock as well, but also cotton textile waste. So within this example here, I'm showing you denim scraps, for instance, which can be converted into a fibre. And this cellulosic feedstock is extracted and it's turned into a pulp. A little bit, it feels a little bit like paper. Hopefully you can see the texture of that on the screen here. That pulp is then dissolved into making a fibre, which is then spun into a yarn and eventually woven into a fabric or knitted into a fabric and converted into products. So probably from fibre to products, very similar to other materials, but this cellulosic extraction and pulp is really more specific to MMCF fibres. So what is viscose? And I have borrowed this infographic from the Changing Markets Foundation, which is an NGO really starting to look at different fibre types. And here you can see a little bit more detailed around how viscose is manufactured, but essentially following those steps that I just showed you. So cellulosic feedstock extracted, it's then turned into a pulp that is then extruded into a fibre and goes through a number of different washing processes to make sure that fibre is strong, and then it's fit for purpose and what it's designed for. But here you can really see, you'll see a number of different red text here, and this is to really highlight the different chemicals which go into making this fibre. And in particular, carbon disulfide, which has been a risk that has been identified and can create harmful impacts across the supply chain, which again, I'll talk a little bit more about what those impacts are. So I think really interesting graphic to look at. I won't go through every single step, but really useful to see the number of different processes that are involved in making this fibre and a number of different chemicals used to manufacture it as well. So what is the difference between viscose and other MMCF fibres? I think there are a few differences. The main one being that the type of wood or feedstock requirement that might be used to make these fibres. And the second one is really about what chemicals are being used to manufacture these fibres. So they might be slightly different depending on what fibre is being produced. And they all have very slightly different hand feels because of that when the fibre is made. The most notable difference, I would say, is around lyocell fibres. So lyocell fibres are made using what we call a closed loop production system. And this essentially means that the water and the chemicals are recovered and treated and put back into the manufacturing process. So really making the most use of the resources that are put into making these fibres and hopefully saving energy and water at the same time. We often hear about bamboo fibres, and people often have this perception that this is a natural fibre. There are, I guess, two different fibres as how I see it for bamboo. There's a bamboo bast fibre which is made, but there is also bamboo viscose which is made. So usually if you buy a piece of clothing with bamboo viscose, you probably wouldn't know it's made from bamboo because it would probably be labelled as viscose on the garment. And so what are the impacts? I've already spoken about the chemicals used in the production, which was highlighted probably about 5 years ago now by the Changing Markets Foundation as a risk in terms of environmental pollution. Chemicals not being used properly, chemicals causing a risk for workers' health, but also potential to, if they're not managed properly, to be damaging for the environment and harmful for the environment too. But we also see risks around the raw materials being used to make that fibre. So increasing concerns around deforestation, trees being cut down essentially to make wood-derived materials and wood-derived textiles like MMCFs. And this is, one of the things that came out of the Textile Exchange conference last week was really about how do we protect our forests. They are, I think, around 31% of the total land that we have around the globe, and really essential to making sure that we can manage climate change by capturing carbon and protecting biodiversity as well. So really crucial in making sure that we protect our forests. And here are just some headlines that we saw in the news over the last few years. But a number of different articles have been published throughout the last few years. So really a lot of media attention around this topic and a lot of concern that we need to make sure that we address as an industry. And so I've touched already on some of the environmental impacts, but we also do see social impacts as well with these fibres. So with what I've already mentioned, the two impacts, so one being raw material feedstock and one being the fibre production, we do see that there can potentially be an impact on local communities as well. We see that in forests, Indigenous communities depend on those forests and have livelihoods there. So we need to make sure that any forests that are being, or trees that are being deforested to use for fibres, that there is not an impact on those local communities. But we also see from a fibre manufacturing process risks around worker health and safety, but also again risks to the local communities if those chemicals are not properly being managed and being discharged into the environment. So lots of considerations here around social and environmental impacts, but a lot of work has been done over the last 5 years or so by fibre producers to really address these impacts and making sure that more conventional materials and more sustainable materials are more responsibly managed. So what are the solutions to address these impacts? I think first of all, really important to highlight transparency across the supply chain. We need to know where our materials are being produced, where the raw materials are being bought from, so that we can help to mitigate and manage some of these impacts. I think that's relevant for all of the fibres that we produce, and something that you will hear a lot about is traceability and transparency. It sounds really easy, but it's also very difficult. So we need to all work with our supply chain to make sure that we have that transparency. And that's really the foundation, I would say, to addressing these impacts. But there are also some specific actions which a lot of brands and organisations are taking to address these impacts. So I'll start on the left-hand side here. When we talk about raw material feedstock, it's really about if we are sourcing virgin wood, making sure that we are purchasing from certified and responsibly managed forests. So there are a few recognised certification schemes out there which suppliers can look into. But ultimately, we want to be making sure that we are reducing our dependency on those virgin resources. So looking at how do we purchase more recycled materials instead. And again, making sure we have the certification in place to prove and validate that. And we're also seeing a huge movement in terms of the next generation solutions, which I'll talk to you a little bit more about at the end. I've got a very nice video which summarises it. But essentially, this is about making sure, or we're looking at innovations around using waste byproducts instead of virgin wood. So this might be waste from agricultural waste, or it might be textile waste made from, again, cellulosic based materials. So lots of innovation happening around that space, and really kind of where I see the future of MMCFs leading us to. And then in terms of pulp and fibre production, again, lots happening in this space with fibre producers, but really focusing on three things. So firstly, making sure producers are operating closed loop systems. So that system that I mentioned earlier around lyocell, and really making sure all the resources are being captured, recovered and reused in the production process to minimise waste, but also minimise energy and water use as well. Producers, when we talk about recovery rates and emission rates, producers also looking more at how they can meet EU BAT requirements. So I'll talk a little bit more detail about that in a moment. But essentially, these are requirements set by the European Commission around recovery rates for different chemicals and air pollution requirements. And lastly, before I go into how these fibres are becoming more sustainable, we do see a lot of producers now adopting ZDHC MMCF guidelines, so guidelines specifically tailored to this type of fibre production, and some great work there by ZDHC, which stands for Zero Discharge of Hazardous Chemicals. So this is, I guess, the main part of the presentation, and hopefully the one that you're most excited about to learn more, is really how is viscose becoming more sustainable. And there's so many different initiatives out there, so many different organisations doing great things, and I've just picked out here a few tools to share with you, but this is by no means the only things that are available to use on the market, but I think tools which are very helpful to get the industry together and align on what the requirements are for becoming more sustainable. So we spoke a little bit about Textile Exchange at the beginning of this presentation, but a few years ago, a group of brands got together to start talking about the different requirements that we need to know, and what requirements fibre producers need to meet. And we started looking at a number of different topics. So we started looking at what certifications they have, what current requirements they're meeting, are they meeting the BAT requirements that I just mentioned, how are they managing their waste, how are they managing their pollution requirements. And I'm pleased to say that this questionnaire, which is just a very small snapshot of it on the screen, doesn't really do it justice, but this questionnaire was adopted by Textile Exchange, I think a year or two ago, and is publicly available on the website. And really the intention is that we come with an alignment from fibre producers to ask the same questions and get the same responses, so that we can really have that transparency that I mentioned around the supply chain. And each fibre producer completes this questionnaire, and many of them are now disclosing it on their website as well. So you can even go onto these fibre producers' websites and download this information. So it's becoming really a lot more transparent in terms of what fibre producers' capabilities are, but also how they're managing their environmental compliance. So huge progress, I would say, as an industry to get to this point. And this questionnaire is tailored around the parent company organisation, fibre producer organisation, but also very site-specific information as well, which is really important when we're talking about compliance and environmental sustainability. So we can then use that information to look at a number of different things, whether it be the raw materials, but also the fibre production processing as well. And in terms of raw materials, a shout out really here to Canopy, who have done amazing work for the last several years, established in 1999, but really Canopy are a non-profit organisation working towards protecting ancient and endangered forests. So they're a huge collaborator, making sure they're working with organisations like brands, like packaging suppliers, like fibre producers, collaborating with all these organisations to really foster innovative solutions to protect our world's forests. So that might be through sourcing more responsibly managed fibres, or it might be through those next generation solutions that I mentioned. And Canopy have a number of different initiatives and a number of different tools which their signatories can adopt, but also are publicly available on their website. So here are just a few on this screen, but I'm going to focus on the CanopyStyle initiative, which was launched, I can't remember exactly when, but several years ago, and pleased to say that we are also now partners of this partnership. Really commitments from brands to stop sourcing from ancient and endangered forests. And Canopy do an amazing job with working directly with fibre producers to look at their responsible sourcing policies and auditing their sites as well to make sure that they're not sourcing from high risk forests. And within this initiative, we also use this very useful tool called the hot button report. And called the hot button report because, as you can see on the right hand slide here, there are a number of different shirts with different colours on, and this is like a rating or ranking system which helps us to really identify which producers are manufacturing responsibly and which ones are not. So a really useful tool and an easy way to identify which producers are performing well against a number of different set criteria set by Canopy. And I think Canopy announced a couple of weeks ago, they now have around 53% of the global fibre producers now within that green category, which is really what we're aiming for. So again, some great progress by fibre producers to meet a very strict set of criteria. Fibre producers are also audited by Canopy and their third party, so we can help, which will help to verify this information for us and really helps to align the industry and get producers sourcing more sustainably. If you haven't seen it, it's definitely worth having a look at this on the Canopy website. They've just updated their hot button report a couple of weeks ago, so you have the very most up-to-date information there and a ranking of all the different fibre producers and where they're at in their journey. And then when we look at the fibre production side, I've already mentioned the ZDHC guidelines, and here you can again just see a little bit of a snapshot really, but In April 2020, ZDHC produced these very technical guidelines specifically for use by fibre producers. And these guidelines, again, really set an industry standard, an industry benchmark to look at what are the parameters that fibre producers need to manage in terms of their input, their process and their outputs. So looking at the chemistry used, looking at the wastewater requirements, looking at the sludge requirements, and also the air emissions as well. And so absolutely, again, fantastic work by this organisation in a number of different areas, but really great to see the focus here on MMCF and the importance of this fibre in the industry as well. And these guidelines were developed, as all of the ZDHC guidelines are, in conjunction and in collaboration with the industry, whether that be through experts in brand organisations, but also the chemical companies and fibre production companies as well. So within each of these guidelines, as I mentioned, there are specific parameters, but also different requirements which the fibre producers need to meet. And there is a scoring or level system, which is foundational, progressive and aspirational. So you can really see the progress that fibre producers are starting to make against each of the parameters. And this, I was saying to Ian, this is quite a technical slide, but I did want to, I guess, highlight here that when we're looking at fibre production and standards and requirements that I mentioned, there are industry standards out there. So all brands and all fibre producers are working towards the same thing. Here is just really a snapshot from the EU best available technology reference document. And within this document, again, you can see here requirements around air pollution, requirements around water pollution, but also energy and solid waste requirements as well. So we see, although this is an EU BOT reference document, we do see this being adopted by many fibre producers, which are often located outside of the EU. So mainly production happening in China, in India, and Indonesia as well. So I just have one more slide, I think, and really just want to go back to the raw materials side and share with you this inspirational video around next generation solutions and really the future of what we see viscose being made from.
There are remarkable solutions available for the world's climate challenges and biodiversity loss. We call them next-gen solutions, and they utilize what is currently considered waste to save forests and the planet. Every year, over 3 billion trees are cut down for fashion fabrics like viscose and rayon, and paper packaging like boxes. Much of this comes from the world's most ancient and endangered forests, ecosystems vital for millions of species, stabilizing our climate and preventing future health pandemics. At the same time, every second around the world, mountains of waste are created. Harnessing innovation to use that waste and turn it into solutions that save forests and reduce landfills is the key to our survival. Canopy, along with its partners around the world, have solutions to create a win-win for the Earth, business and humanity. Instead of cutting down the world's remaining forests, new technologies can make paper packaging and viscose from almost any food waste or agricultural and cotton textile waste. Next-gen solution pulp mills are being built that use alternatives to wood from forests, and farmers are already selling their waste straw to these mills, garnering additional income and creating economic support in their communities. New businesses are also popping up to recycle waste textiles.
We researched how many next-gen mills need to be built to save 50% of the world's forest by 2030. And we found that $69 billion in investment is required to build enough low-impact paper, packaging, and viscose mills.
Over the next decade, it is vital that hundreds of these next-gen mills be built or retrofitted in dozens of countries. Healthy forests are vital to a safe climate, societal health, and the economies we build. With next-gen solutions, there is a clear pathway to achieving the science-based targets for climate and biodiversity by 2030.
This is the turnaround decade. We don't have a choice but to transform our production and consumption systems. And fortunately, the solutions are right in front of us. The technologies are here, the market is ready, and now it's time to invest in a brighter future.
So, Nicole, thank you very much indeed. I must say, I had an unfair advantage over everyone else because I did have a look at this last week when you were presenting it to me from Colorado Springs. So, and I knew we already had a good presentation, but today seeing it live with an audience has been fantastic. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to invite any questions. I have a few myself, but I'm going to reserve those because I think it's for our attendees to have the first opportunity. So who would like to start, please? And if you could just unmute yourself if you have a question, that is obviously going to help a lot.
Oh, I just put something in the chat, but I can ask it. So, Nicole, I wanted to ask you, what are the main types of wood used as the starting material? Do you have any information on that?
Yes, I don't know the main type, but I know we see a lot of beech, we see a lot of pine and eucalyptus as well being used in our products. So I think if we look at responsible forestry certifications, we can understand through those certifications the type of wood that is being used. But those, to my knowledge, are the three main types being used.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you. I was curious to know, Nicole, having, as you know, worked at M&S for many years, one of the big fibre blends that was and is being used is either polyviscose or polyviscose elastane. And I just wonder, under the umbrella of your circularity role, what sort of challenge that presents when it comes to recycling. Can, let's say, the viscose element be extracted and reused, or is that a fabric blend that at the moment needs to go to landfill or just reuse in a fabric, in an existing fabric?
Yeah, good question. An additional challenge I think that we face, understanding the fibres and how to make them more sustainable is the first step. But when you start blending them into fabric, that brings up a whole another set of challenges. And we do have targets around designing products to be recyclable. And from what we've understand and been working with recyclers on, is really that mono materials or fabrics made from one fibre type is really what we need to be designing into to make sure that those fabrics can be recycled when they reach the end of their life. And we do see a lot of innovation in this space around materials and recycling technologies, essentially. Many of them can mechanically recycle cotton. We see some materials like polyester being chemically recycled. We see some innovations around separating cotton and poly, but at the moment we haven't seen particular innovations around removing viscose or removing elastane content from blended fibres. So I think if we're mixing essentially natural and synthetic materials, we are going to see a little bit of a challenge in the short term until technologies really come to scale. But there's definitely lots of innovation happening out there. But I'd say if you want to be thinking about recyclability, monomaterials is really the direction that we're getting from recyclers at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much. So a big challenge there. Now, I see two questions here. One is from a gentleman, I think called Tausif, excuse me if I mispronounce your name. and also there's one from Mervyn. So let's start with Tausif.
Okay, and I think you pronounced it well. Thank you. So my question, Nicole, so I am Tausif. I'm an associate professor at University of Leeds in sustainable textile manufacturing. So my question is, so if you compare viscose versus lyocell, so lyocell has a better environmental credentials the way it is produced. So other than cost, what is stopping more and more lyocell production and viscose going down? Because they use the same source, and if the production method becomes more sustainable as well, that might have a bigger impact. So from a brand perspective, what are the challenges there?
Yeah, good question. And I'll be honest, I'm not the team putting these fibres into products. That's our product sustainability team. But we do see more and more conventional viscose being converted into being manufactured in a closed loop production as well. So we are seeing that increase. We are seeing adoption of lyocell fabrics, but maybe not at the extent or rate that we would hope. So there are different challenges in terms of hand fill and drape of that material for our product use. But I'm not sure whether it's a cost reason. I'd have to defer to my product sustainability colleagues for that.
Okay, thank you very much. Tausif, is that good for you?
Yeah, no, I think thank you much, but it will be interesting to see how the closed loop for viscose compares to the lyocell process, I think. And because I know there's a quite a big cost difference. So cost is definitely a major factor there, of course. Yeah, thank you.
Mervyn, can I ask you to ask your question directly? It'll be good for everybody to hear you.
Yes, indeed. Well. First of all, thank you for a very, very interesting presentation. My question is, this is really, really exciting stuff to me because I've not been in the loop for this sort of thing for some time. How do we actually get this information over to the general public who buy the ultimate garment? Because I'm not too sure they recognize the sort of environmental issues that surround viscose. I'm not too sure whether they recognize that it's either a man-made fiber or whether it's a natural fiber. Obviously, they know that natural fibers are wool and cotton, but where does the viscose fit into this? So I'm intrigued to know how we get that, particularly that last part of your presentation, out into the public domain. I have a secondary little issue about bamboo, because I do see products where the labeling, the prominent labeling, it says bamboo, predominantly bamboo socks, for example, but it's only when you got to the back where you see the actual breakdown where it might just say bamboo viscose. So there's a little bit of something that's not quite right in my mind, and I don't know how we get over that because legally it conforms.
So a couple of questions there, I think, Nicole. I think first of all, the big question from Mervyn, if I may summarize, is how to get the big message across to the public about some of these environmental risks and how they're being dealt with. And then kind of a secondary question about bamboo, for example. I mean, to put it bluntly, is there greenwashing going on with some brands? Because bamboo sounds very friendly and it grows fast, and people don't really understand that it may not be true bamboo that's in that pair of socks. Would you look at those two questions, please?
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned earlier on the presentation, every single fibre has a different impact. For cotton, it might be the water being used. For MMCF, it might be the chemicals or the feedstock. And for polyester, it's the use of non-renewable resources. And I think getting those messages across to the consumer in the right way is very, very tricky. And often, as a technical person, I'm going to my comms team say, you can say this, you can't say that, but how do we say it in a way that is consumer friendly and that they understand? And I think there's a bit of a balance there between being technically correct, but also using consumer friendly language as well. And how do we communicate that on labeling? And I've seen recently an increase in infographics being used on labels to really educate consumers on, well, actually, this might be made from waste, for example, it's then cut up and spun into a new fibre. And I think how do we communicate that for viscose or MMCFs? I'm not quite sure, but you know, lots of innovations there in how we can communicate to consumers in a consumer-friendly way. But also, you know, everyone has social media these days, and I think that's a real powerful platform that we can use to educate consumers not only on fibres and how they're made, but how they can care for their clothes, how they can repair their clothes, and can really be part of making fashion and more sustainable. So it's not just how the product's made, but how we use it, that product within the life cycle as well. And I think, yeah, bamboo viscose is one that probably I wasn't aware of until about 3-4 years ago either, you know, that there are differences. And again, I think it's really about, you know, being truthful and accurate in what you're disclaiming on a label, but also what is a legal requirement, because I don't believe bamboo viscose is, at least within the EU labelling system, technically correct. I think the correct term would be viscose or lyocell. And so I think it is one that we definitely have to be more cautious of, and to avoid any greenwashing, like you say, Ian. You know, we obviously don't want to do that, but I think it's the education piece is extremely important as well.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of legalities at the side of bamboo. I mean, if you look at the US, I mean, it's illegal to call bamboo sustainable, and it's a requirement. You have to put the viscose word or rayon word after the word bamboo to stay legal, and that's what's spilled out into the EU legislation as well. So I think there's a lot of strengthening to be done around that message, and I think Nicole would agree with me. You know, it's very, very loose for too long, to be honest, and it has led to quite a lot of greenwashing with some brands in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good, thank you. Mervyn, are you? Well, yes, you're muted, but I see you.
Yeah, I guess what we really need is a champion to spread the message. Really, I don't know who or what that can be, but I guess that's what we ideally need. But yes, thank you.
Yeah, good. I mean, I think what comes across to me in today's presentation is that there's a very broad group of retailers and brands involved in this, much and as you say, it overlaps into the ZDHC or ZDHC, depending on how you like to pronounce it, because that again is a vast and growing group of brands who all have environmental matters and sustainability matters on the top of their agenda, and so hopefully this will progress. Yes, I was interested. Just one question before I pass to one of the other members of our group. In fact, actually, I'm going to ask Philippa actually, because you've asked a question there. Do you want to just ask that to directly to Nicole, please? Your question.
Yeah, sure. No, it's something I've always wondered. I mean, we know that bamboo does have its own feeling. I mean, I know it's viscose, but it's I just wondered, do you know if there is a different quality or fiber or fabric from different sources of cellulose or different trees? Do they produce? I mean, it's just a question I have, really. I'm just curious to know whether there is, because there are also all the other fibers like acetate. Gosh, I can't remember them all now, but I mean, they all come from different sources, I believe, or different cellulose sources, I should say. Do you know if there are differences?
There's definitely differences in terms of the type of fibers. So a viscose, a modal, and a cupro acetate will all look and handle very differently. But I don't think apart from maybe textile waste, for example, textile waste uses cellulosic feedstock.
And that goes into cupro, I think, does it? Yeah.
Also lyocell as well, we see a lot happening in that space. But those are relatively new. I think only about 7 fibre producers at the moment are producing those next generation solutions that I mentioned. So whether that be from textile waste or agricultural waste, and they all have slightly different hand fills, they all have slightly different processes. So yes, there will be differences in quality and performance as well of those fibres.
Bamboo is the one that has become most well known, though, because when you're talking about acetate or cupro, nobody ever refers to the source of it.
No.
Bamboo
Yeah,
is the only one actually that does refer to its source.
There are,
which is interesting.
Two types of fibres. So there is the bamboo viscose and a bamboo as a bast fibre. So I think that's
true.
something important to look out for on the label as well, just to make sure.
Yes, I mean, it sounds to me like it's about honest and robust labelling, and as Graham mentioned earlier, making sure that behind it there's legislation, so that if there is misleading labelling in a country where there is clear legislation, the product could presumably be ultimately removed from sale. So that's got to be the proper way of dealing with it, I guess. So any further questions from people in the audience today?
Yes, I've got one again. When waste textiles are used as the starting material, do they have to be undyed? Do you have any information on that, or are you able to use dyed goods as well?
Again, it's very dependent on the technology that's available. We are seeing more and more recyclers able to recycle textiles with colour. So denim, for example, is often used as a feedstock as a textile waste, but we do definitely see recyclers see a high value in white cotton materials, but it's not to say that they can't recycle colours. It's really dependent on the technology available, because every producer, every manufacturer has slightly different requirements and what they can accept as a feedstock. But yes, colours can be turned into new fibres.
Thank you.
Nicole, just coming back to viscose, you showed a fantastic chart earlier on, which I couldn't begin to unfathom in the time we had. I'll have to have a look at it later or on the video. But that chart, certainly you talk about some of the, I guess, hazardous chemicals that have been and maybe are still being used in the production of viscose. So what's happening about the progression to eliminate hazardous chemicals and substitute them with chemicals that would be considered safe under the umbrella of ZDHC?
I think we have Graham's story on the line. I don't know if that.
Yes, that was partly a question for him, actually. Yeah, the disguised question for him.
Graham is the expert of the ZDHC.
Yeah, well, certainly a lot of the work's been done with the emissions. I mean, the change in the chemistry for the viscose production is not as easy as just substituting, because it's about not having regrettable substitutions. So there is work going on to find the solution to releasing sulfur into the atmosphere, but you know, viscose is a notoriously dirty fibre to produce, and which is why the success of lyocell and tencel got to the forefront. And I'm sure there's quite a few people on this call that have been involved with tencel, so we know that that's produced in a closed loop, so it's solvent spun, and it's got a much more friendly production cycle. But a lot of the work, as I say, has been done in ZDHC about how you can control the emissions, both from air emissions and water emissions, and really in getting challenging but achievable limits on doing that. I mean, we found that with ZDHC on the dye industry. You can't just go out there and put really stringent limits on companies, because you just get these chemical conglomerates just just walk away and give a very much take it to leave it. But if you do something that's challenging and you gradually tighten those limits over a period of time, then you start to make progress. And ZDHC was formed by many brands coming together because it was quite clear that the problem was too big for one individual brand to change direction. So, I mean, like many, I've been involved with many different multi-brand initiatives, but ZDHC was the first one I've been involved with where actually brands came together, were honest with each other and worked together to actually drive the change. So it's been, you know, very refreshing over the 11 years that it's been going now to see that change going. And, you know, we can see a real clear way in industry when it comes to dyeing and finishing chemicals around the world. And since the rollout of MMCF, you know, we started to see the engagement. There's a lot of the core manufacturers, which I'm sure Nicole is working with, that have engaged in the wastewater standards and are starting to report their emissions. So I would think within another year, we'll start to see some really clear direction in the way viscose production is going.
Graham, thank you very much indeed. That's really been very, very helpful indeed. Actually, turning to the topic of collaborative organisations and brands, Nicole, could you just give us in the last few minutes of Q&A a little summary of what were some of the key outcomes of the Textile Exchange conference last week in Colorado Springs?
Yeah, so a huge, I think, focus on their LCA Plus methodology, which they have launched with their Climate Plus strategy over the last couple of years. So really looking at data and science-driven ways to measure the impacts of materials. And, you know, we're not just talking about carbon impacts, but we're also talking about the impacts on water, biodiversity, soil health. So really important that we don't just have that carbon tunnel vision when we're looking at materials and regrettable substitutions, as Graham just mentioned, for the chemicals side as well. And a huge focus on natural materials, I would say. So, you know, a huge I guess awakening around the importance of our forests that they have on climate change, the importance of managing soil health from the growing and natural crops like cotton. So I think some huge topics that they've covered and some huge outcomes in terms of how do we really manage our natural resources, soil health, and biodiversity and so on. So I'm sure there'll be plenty more that Textile Exchange will be able to release and share soon. But, you know, great again to have everyone in person, lots of brands, lots of producers, lots of organisations with solutions as well, like these next generation solutions that we've mentioned. And yeah, great to get everyone together talking again.
That's really good indeed, and thank you very much for joining us. Literally having just stepped off a plane yesterday morning from the States, we do appreciate your preparation, thorough preparation.
No worries. Thank you for the invitation.
Today's talk, and not only will this group have the opportunity to see it, but as I mentioned and as Philippa mentioned earlier, we will be converting this into a video for YouTube, so others who could not attend today will be able to see it and hear what you had to say, and indeed the questions. And thank you all very much indeed for your questions. I think that that's further expanded the knowledge that we already received from Nicole.